All right, guys, welcome back. We are up to topic 8.9 of the APUSH curriculum, and we are going to focus today on President Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, and his program known as the Great Society. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to begin by getting LBJ president, which means we need to talk a little bit about the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. One of the most infamous moments of the 20th century, certainly. For anyone who lived through it, a moment they will vividly remember for the rest of their life, where they were at when they heard it, and that kind of thing. So just a couple quick details. JFK was in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963. He was basically looking ahead to the next year in 1964 when he would be running for re-election, and Texas was a state he certainly wanted to win. So this is, I won't say it's a campaign stop, but it's a goodwill tour, if nothing else. And he is shot and killed, allegedly, by the assassin Lee Harvey Oswald. I say allegedly because Lee Harvey Oswald, of course, never actually got a day in court. And this has led to all kinds of speculation that this was some sort of conspiracy. I mean, you name it, there's a conspiracy out there about this assassination. Some people allege that this was the mafia punishing the Kennedy family for going after them. Bobby Kennedy was our attorney general under JFK, and he had pursued the mafia and that kind of stuff. There's also the allegation that Cuba did this, or maybe the Soviets did this, or there's even some who think Lyndon Johnson had a hand in this so he could become president. None of that stuff has ever been proven, and frankly, nothing ever will be proven because, again, the alleged assassin was arrested and then shortly thereafter murdered. And this, of course, is only going to add fuel to the fire that this is some sort of conspiracy, that the killer was then killed to cover up, the story or whatever. So once JFK is killed, of course, we know how the Constitution works. Lyndon Johnson is going to be sworn in, and he pledges himself to basically carry out a lot of JFK's policies. As I mentioned, the assassination of JFK led to all kinds of conspiracies and questions. The government conducted something called the Warren Commission, and it did conclude that Oswald acted alone, but there will always be questions about this murder. By the way, one more quick note here on JFK before we talk about LBJ. JFK is, because he was cut down in his first term and he was young and charismatic, there are a lot of people have kind of a romantic view of him in the sense that he's remembered as a great president. I don't know historically if you can say that, but he certainly did inspire a lot of young people. In fact, you can see in this picture JFK shaking hands with a young future president here, Bill Clinton. And there's Kennedy's grave in Arlington today. All right, now let's talk about President Lyndon Johnson. So just a little bit of background on this guy. He was from Texas. He grew up in very meager circumstances. He eventually went to Congress as an FDR New Deal Democrat. And he turned out to be a very tough negotiator. He was famous for this thing called the Johnson treatment. And the Johnson treatment is when he was talking to people, he would get really close, like right up in their personal space. And this was his means of, I don't know if I'd say intimidation, but it's certainly a means of sort of trying to control the conversation and trying to bend the other person to your will. And you can see some famous pictures here of the Johnson treatment. Again, very close in. This one is one of my favorites, where he's basically just backed this guy up onto a desk. Another view. All right, now let's talk about his ambitious program known as the Great Society. That's the topic's title. And LBJ saw this as kind of like his own New Deal. And what this was is the federal government was going to spend lots and lots and lots of money in achieving certain goals. We're going to get into the specific goals in a second, but one of those was his war on poverty, that we're going to treat poverty almost like it's a public illness that has to be defeated. We're gonna cure cancer by developing medicines and all this kind of stuff. Well, maybe we can cure poverty as well. Let's put our resources towards that. And you can see, areas that he would be focused on. Basically, Appalachia was really the heart and center of mass poverty in America, and frankly, it still is. In fact, if you look here in 2015, you'll notice Appalachia, certainly lots of poverty still there, but obviously other pockets here in the Deep South as well. All right, now let's get into the election in 1964, and then we'll talk more about the Great Society. So that is what LBJ is going to run on. Now remember, he's not running for re-election because he's finishing out JFK's first term. So in 64, he's running really as president in his own right. Vote for me, and I will put into place my great society with all my goals and ambitions. Republicans chose a conservative named Barry Goldwater, who's a senator from Arizona. And Barry Goldwater was very much opposed to big government, to massive government spending. He was very much worried that the Great Society was going to be just a massive waste of time and money. And specifically, Goldwater has a lot of things he wants to fix in the government. He wants to go after the federal income tax. He wants to reduce or limit Social Security because it's so expensive. He wanted to privatize TVA because, for the same reason we talked about TVA during the New Deal. It's a public company competing against private companies. He was going after civil rights legislation, and before you automatically assume he must be a racist, then from his perspective, he wanted to see civil rights handled on a state level, not the federal level. So he was opposed to sweeping federal civil rights legislation. He was against the nuclear test ban treaty. He wanted to test nuclear weapons to promote American strength. And basically, number one, he's totally against the Great Society. So his slogan, what people said about him anyways in his campaign, you see this on the button, in your heart, you know he's right. In other words, you may be afraid to say publicly that you're against Social Security, but in your heart, you know it's too expensive. That's kind of like the message they're trying to send. Democrats responded with, in your guts, you know he's nuts. So, there you go. Democrats really tried to play up this image of Goldwater as being this guy who's going to be too provocative, who wants to maybe even start a war with the Soviet Union or something like that. And the still I have on there on the slide for you, this is a still from a famous campaign ad that the Democrats ran where this little girl, she's picking off the little petals from the flower, she's counting down. And then in the background, there's this announcer's counting down also. And then all of a sudden, there's this nuclear bomb going off like in the background. And it's trying to basically show that Goldwater is dangerous and he might lead to a nuclear war if he were elected. All right, so let's go to the results. The map certainly makes it look like a Lyndon Johnson landslide. He wins almost 91% of the electoral vote. And in the popular vote, it is a landslide. So LBJ wins big. And not only that, but Democrats take both houses. So this is very much kind of like an FDR in 1932. He's got the wind at his back and Congress at his side. One more thing I do want to say, though, before we move on, is this is a remarkable transformation. We have mentioned the so-called Solid South many times since Reconstruction, right? The Solid South being solidly Democratic. Well, if you look, all of a sudden, not so solid. States that had never voted Republican are now voting Republican. All right, so let's now look at the Great Society and LBJ's efforts in Congress. So here is what we're going to call his big four. Like, these are the four things we want to accomplish with the Great Society. We want to spend more federal dollars on education. We'll get to some details on that in a moment. We want to spend more money on medical care for the poor and elderly so that they will also have access to health care. We want to reform immigration, and we want to put forth a new voting rights bill. So let's go through some of these big four. Number one, federal aid will now be targeted towards only non-segregated schools. So if you are a public school and you hadn't yet desegregated, in other words, you still haven't followed along with Brown versus Board of Education from back in 1954, you're not getting any federal help. Okay. Secondly, the federal government decides to begin this program known as Head Start. And Head Start is basically a pre-K program. The theory is if you can get kids from poorer families into school sooner, then maybe you can close some of that gap that will exist in kindergarten. Because, you know, there are kids who come into kindergarten who can read and write, and then there are kids who don't even know A, B, and C. And so if you can try to catch up those kids before they go into kindergarten, they won't fall behind, and they'll be more likely to succeed. And that is what Head Start is all about. All right, we mentioned healthcare a moment ago. The government is going to spend billions of dollars in Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare is for people over a certain age. I believe it's 65. Don't quote me on that, but I believe that's right. And then there's also Medicaid. So if you can't afford health care, the government will help subsidize your health care. Now, does that help people? Absolutely it does. We don't want to see, you know, grandma without her medicine or a poor person not be able to get treatment. But the reality is that medical care becomes really, really expensive, and it's now on the shoulders of the taxpayers. And that is something that will not be without controversy. All right, we mentioned immigration reform was a big part of the Great Society. And so in 1965, we have a major shift in how we handle immigration. If you recall, back in the 1920s, we had put into place these limits, these quotas based on national origins. That's thrown out. And as a result, immigration really changes because instead of it being European in nature, okay, white in other words, what you're going to have is a vast surge in Latin America and Asian immigration. So you can see again, 1960, where are immigrants coming from? Mainly Europe, just a little bit from Latin America, just a little bit from Asia. And then after this, by 2013, Europeans are down to only 14%. Asians and Latin Americans make up the majority of new Americans. Okay, so what can we say about the Great Society? Was it a success or was it a waste? Well, the critics certainly said it was a waste. That billions and billions of dollars had been spent and, well, had poverty disappeared? No. Had all kids gone from behind to on grade level? No. Did poor people all of a sudden have the best health care in the world? Well, no. I mean, so the critics would say we spent all this money and we didn't actually get much out of it. Whereas on the other side of the coin, just like the New Deal, there's another side of the story. Supporters of the Great Society would say that money we spent was a good investment in the American people, that letting people just be poor and sickly is not fair. All right, so that is the evaluation of the Great Society. One more thing to say, guys. Remember, at the same time the government's spending billions on Great Society, they're also spending billions on Vietnam. And it turns out the government only has so many billions. And the Great Society, frankly, never reaches the fulfillment, its potential that LBJ envisioned because the Vietnam War took so much money and attention away from it. So LBJ tried to fight a war and create a new America, and you could argue that he wasn't able to do either of them because he tried to do two things at once. All right, that's it for the Great Society. Definitely look it over, guys. Be familiar with why Americans' relationship with the federal government changed during the Great Society. And in our next video, we'll move on and keep working our way through Period 8.